You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome Bill Roggio to the show. Bill is an enormous contributor to the things that matter to us on the show, to the defense of this country that he obviously loves. Bill's the editor of the Long War Journal, which does a phenomenal job of diving deep into the issues that are occurring around the world, particularly in the Middle East, as well as being a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Bill, welcome back to the Final Say.
Thanks for having me back on. Pleasure.
Well, Bill, I don't know how you sleep at night. It's like the fodder just rolls in, with reckless abandon every 5 minutes. But what I want to do in the segment that we have you on is I want to try to do a little bit more on the educational front, because even myself, Bill, I find when you look at the scenario, what's going on there, it's as though we're playing a chess game, which is not only complicated enough, but the pieces keep changing colors, the pieces keep changing shape, and the board changes dimensions. So one of the things I'd love for you to do is to help educate our audience a little bit about, let's start with what's going on with ISIS and start addressing some of the players around there, because it's a really fuzzy topic, and I think it's difficult for most people to digest the news where they don't even know, for example, how does ISIS compare to some of the other terrorist organizations, and maybe if you can, within that, address a little bit where the problem with ISIS really becomes, and is it, in fact, America's problem? And then we could talk a little bit more about some of the other players in that area.
Sure, absolutely. And first, I'm going to alter your analogy a little bit. We're playing tic-tac-toe while our enemy's playing chess, and that's why we're in this situation today. We refuse to recognize the complexities of this, and we're dealing with this, the administration is dealing with this problem under terms that it wants to define as opposed to terms that really exist. For instance, it was telling us even up to the beginning to mid part of this year that ISIS, or which is called the Islamic State, the actual name for it, was really just a local terrorist group that wasn't a threat to the United States. It was a problem in Iraq or a problem in Syria that we wouldn't have to deal with, and now we're launching airstrikes and calling it one of the greatest threats to national security. That's because it refused to recognize what ISIS was until it couldn't refuse to do so any longer. The Islamic State is, or ISIS as it's often called, what it merely is it's al-qaeda in Iraq. Al-qaeda in Iraq, which was formed after the U.S. invasion, became the Islamic State in Iraq. At some point when the Syrian Revolution, or the Syrian Civil War started, the Islamic State created a group called the al-Nusra Front, which is, again, an official al-Qaeda group. Then it tried to take control of that group and make it its own and create the Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham. This created a dispute with other jihadist groups in Syria, mainly the al-Nusra Front and some allied groups in the area inside Syria. There was a dispute that went all the way up to the head of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. He sided with the Nusra Front. That forced, and then he said, look, the Islamic State needs to just go and fight inside Iraq, or actually the Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham, as it was a year plus ago, needs to just go fight in Iraq, let the Nusra Front handle Syria, and everything will be fine. The Islamic State said, no way, that's not going to happen. After about a year of trying to reconcile, Zawahiri and al-Qaeda's senior leadership kicked Islamic State out of al-Qaeda, and then shortly afterwards, several months afterwards, they formed the Islamic State and declared a global caliphate, which is the ultimate goal of al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups as well. So the Islamic State is just merely another jihadist group in the area. It's the child organization of al-Qaeda. They share the same goals. There's just a leadership dispute. So this is the same group we've been fighting in Iraq for over a decade now. And failing to recognize what it was, claiming that the Islamic State was some local jihadist group only interested in the local jihad in Iraq or Syria, was a serious misunderestimation, to use President Bush's word, and it's costing us now, because the U.S. Look, it's no secret, the Obama administration did not want to re-engage in Iraq. It withdrew the U.S. forces in December 2011, pretended everything was fine up until it couldn't pretend any longer. And so it made false claims like local jihadist group, it's not our concern. And now we have what we have today. And it is a threat to the United States. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was a threat. When it became the Islamic State of Iraq, it was a threat. I mean, these are groups that, what they seek to do is establish local states with the ultimate goal of establishing a global caliphate, and conducting attacks on the U.S. is a byproduct of that end goal. So that's
now, we had a mutual friend, Claire Lopez, on yesterday, and she did I thought, a really nice sort of summary analysis of separating this into the jihadis and the non-jihadis. And so, following along that line of thinking a bit, I wanted to introduce and get your opinion on a couple of these players, because if you think about the long war, so to speak, we have Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia really as sort of the key players that we have here. So if you could touch on all three of those and give us your sense of maybe where America might be playing them right and where America is playing them wrong, and also if you have an inclination of which of those we actually have a chance of any long-term success with.
Oh, I'll answer that last question first, and the answer is none. Saudi Arabia has played us for years. We continue. Look, there's a reason why large parts of the 9/11 report are redacted in relation to Saudi Arabia, because the U.S. government doesn't want people to know the involvement of very likely Saudi officials and the al-Qaeda's network that's inside Saudi Arabia, probably either with the government was aware of or parts of it were actively involved with. Iran, the U.S. has no, but regardless of this, the U.S. constantly looks to Saudi Arabia to try and find moderate groups. And meanwhile, the Saudi Arabia supports groups that aren't quite so moderate. They wind up being jihadist groups that just aren't al-Qaeda in name but support the same goals as al-Qaeda. Turkey has allowed the groups like the Islamic State, the al-Nusra Front, groups like the Islamic Front, which are not al-Qaeda but share the same goals as them, all to operate within its territory, to have training bases, to recruit, to send fighters back and forth across and supplies across the border. To this day, Turkey refuses to fight against the Islamic State, even though the Islamic State is going to overrun the town of Kobani right on its border. I don't know what game Turkey is playing. I think part of it is due to the fact that it would like to see its enemies in the PKK, which is a legitimate terrorist organization responsible for the death of tens of thousands of Turkish citizens during the 90s. They certainly don't mind the Islamists beating up on them, and then you also have a Islamist-leaning government, probably to put it mildly, inside Turkey. With Iran, when the U.S. backed off of Iraq, and when we left, we gave Iraq a large. We allowed the Iranians to gain influence inside of Iraq with the Iraqi Shia, and now you have Iranian-backed militias that are leading the fight against the Islamic State inside of Iraq, and the U.S. even conducted airstrikes in support of Iranian-backed militias. Some of these militias that are responsible for killing hundreds of American soldiers just a couple of years ago. So you have an absolute mess, and it's all predicated on the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. When we withdrew, we abandoned our ability to influence events in the region, to keep Iran at bay, to monitor Saudi Arabia. Instead, we're now relying on countries that are not friendly to the United States to achieve our national security goals.
I wholeheartedly agree with your analysis, by the way, and I have to say that, like yourself and many others, I've always bemoaned the fact that we seem to have a complete dearth of strategy and winning tactics, despite the fact that our men and women in uniform are consistently willing and able to win these things, and are also willing to lay down their life when necessary to do the right thing. I think there's also a lack of intellectual honesty, but if you look at that, and that goes in a few directions. One, to actually identifying who the real enemy is and the underlying class of civilization that we're struggling with, which, by the way, I think is also a struggle even within the broader Arab and Muslim world. You know, for the tens of thousands of, nonviolent Muslims who are slaughtered left and right, I think they would argue this is a clash between the 7th century and the 21st century as well. But American leadership, and I'm talking now not just politicians, but major business leaders, if you think about the influence that we have from Saudi Arabia as well as Qatar, we'll throw them in the equation, are we really so easily bought and sold? In other words, is our American soul really so easily purchased that we can't win against the bad guys because we have so much of their money invested in our infrastructure and in our systems?
You know, I always loathe to try and figure out motivations as to why do we rely on the Saudis. I don't understand it, frankly. To me, it seems like a no-brainer. But sometimes it seems like it when you watch government officials, take jobs from, leaving government and taking jobs from Saudi corporations, things of that nature. You can't help but wonder what is going on here. I'm not going to directly accuse anyone of anything, but again, you have to wonder what's going on when are people so motivated by money, or are we just so desperate or unknowledgeable about the events that we just continually say rely on the Saudis. Look, there's a certain mindset that exists in D.C. I'm going to share a very, very quick story. I did a debate in 2012 at Heritage with Bruce Hoffman, who was, the center-left's, President Obama's advisor on Pakistan, and then Lisa Curtis, the Republican advisor on Pakistan. And I lay out the case that Pakistan's a state sponsor of terrorism, and that we should, we have to stop giving it money. So ultimately, a question comes out from the audience of what do we do? And I make some suggestions. Well, maybe think about cutting off visas or cutting off trade or declaring it a state sponsor of terrorism, some type of, something other than just giving the country money and calling them an ally and enabling their activities. And what is Curtis and Reddell's response? We need to continue what we're doing, which is just give Pakistan money. I don't think Curtis or Reddell are on Pakistan's payroll or any. As a matter of fact, I'm certain they're not. I just don't think they have solutions, and they see these problems as too difficult, and just giving money or continuing the same bad policies tend to, it's better than coming up with an actual difficult solution or declaring a country an enemy when it really is.
And it's an interesting phenomenon because there's a whole other side of here, which, of course, is the never-ending sectarian violence between Shia and Sunni. And if you look on a world map, if you map this across the world, you see that there's significantly more Sunnis, so you can understand, plus our original relationship with Saudi Arabia post-World War II from an oil perspective. But when you look at that divide, even just from that perspective, if you consider that, let's pretend there's no cure and this will be a millennia from now, this will still be going on. If you had to pick a side, should we stay on the Sunni side, or is there any logic to ever reconsidering the Shia side? Because I'm not sure we could stay out of it completely.
I don't think we need to pick a side. I think we need to back the individuals within the Muslim world that are aligned with our interests. Just saying we side with the Sunni or we side with the Shia, and that means we're going to side with al-qaeda, Sunni, or Iran, Shia. I think that's just it's an overgeneralization, and we can't get caught in that mindset. We have to identify very real allies that exist, and we've had them in Iraq. For instance, the Awakening was a moderate group that was willing to go to fight al-qaeda, and we abandoned them, and we lost enormous amount of goodwill because of that. But that's what we need to do. We need to pick our allies and back them to the hilt, and not get caught up in this Sunni-Shia divide nonsense.
Excellent. I'm glad you answered it. It wasn't exactly a trick question, but it was a bit of a plant, because I tend to agree with you on that one as well. The problem that I have is that the Sunni-Shia divide transcends the borders, and particularly when we're talking about the borders in the Arab states themselves, those were primarily Western-defined borders, and clearly the people in those regions don't seem to respect those borders as well. But I think in a modern world, we have to respect nation-state borders. The problem is that when America doesn't, for example, go back to the Saudis, you look at I don't know how many, I've seen numbers in the literally tens of thousands of madrasas, most of which have very little in terms of real education. It's just about rote repetition of the Quran, and that is why has been such a spread of radicalism around the world. So you could see the tactical problems with having a strategic partner like Saudi Arabia, and I think we have to, I go back to the intellectual honesty, I think when we're dealing with our nation-state partners, we have to we have to set much higher bars on expectations, and our funding and our mechanisms, we can still be allies, but we have to hold our partners accountable the same way we would hold ourselves accountable in business or in our own local politicians.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more. And look, I mean, to me, it's just odd. We treat this, for those use Saudi Arabia, we provide for Saudi Arabia's security, without a doubt. And yet they act like they have us over a barrel because we need their barrels of oil. Well, with energy, the possibility of energy independence, at some point, the U.S., I mean, look, we should never have sort of prostituted ourselves to the Saudis, and we should have demanded that they stop this nonsense.
Probably about 4 minutes here, so we'll jump right into two more questions that I had for you.
Sure.
Okay, because I think we kind of covered that issue pretty well. So one of the things that I have a big problem with here is that we already discussed it, we don't call the enemy by its name, and I think that affects us also when we come back into how this affects us here in the U.S. It's very easy for these nations to seem far away, but we've literally had beheadings in the streets, and forget the fact that they call them workplace violence, which is nothing more than evidence that we have a president who's not serious about this. But I wanted to point you toward the southern border. The drug cartels, as best as I can tell, tracking this myself for 15, 20 plus years, the drug cartels on our southern border are every bit as violent and as radical and very similar to the clansmanship that goes on in the Arab world, and it seems like there's an ever-increasing pairing between drug cartels and the terrorists. What's your analysis, and what do you think the real threat is on our border? Is it as serious as I think it may be?
I don't see any intelligence or information that exists that there is. I mean, it certainly is a possibility. The criminal groups intermingle. That certainly is a possibility. But it'd probably be bad business for the cartels to be smuggling terrorists in to conduct attacks. That really would bring the heat down from the U.S. as well as Mexico. It's a possibility. Certainly, I don't see any evidence of of collusion between the groups of them smuggling operatives. I know we see reports of this occasionally, and they seem to constantly be smacked down. But until we see something concrete, until someone's captured coming through the border, we get good information. I have to look at those reports with a degree of skepticism.
I hope you're right, because I do too. Now I know the president seems to the Mexican president seems to, for all his insults about America not having any rights to controlling our own border, he does seem to have brought. I was reading just yesterday. He's something in the neighborhood of 80 of the 123 or 33 or something like that of the main target cartel leaders have either been killed or rounded up. So he seems to at least be trying to get his job across. Last question I have for you, and we've got about 30, 45 seconds for you, is ISIS. Are they crazy or are they brilliant?
A little bit of both. I think that It's operating with the same tactics and same ideology as al-Qaeda. I think it has a degree of brilliance in its tactical operations and its ability to conduct multiple operations on multiple fronts. It's probably a little bit crazy because it's so unwilling to work with other jihadist groups. It would really behoove it to be a little bit more inclusive, to reconcile with al-Qaeda and play well with other Islamist groups that haven't sworn allegiance to its emir.
Okay, I'm glad you answered the question without the ethics part of it, because clearly I asked that question more in a Hitler blitzkrieg effectiveness than anything else. Bill,
obviously they're crazy, in a degree of craziness and the way beheading and all that. That's just sort of a monstrously crazy. So, yeah.
But it's an effective scare tactic. Again, ladies and gentlemen, Bill Roggio, editor of the Long War Journal, also a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. You should absolutely go to thelongwarjournal.org. Very simple, longwarjournal.org. And you should also follow Bill on Twitter. Bill is at Bill Roggio. Follow Bill, support Bill. Bill, thanks for your work. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to having you back soon.
Thanks. My pleasure. Have a great day.